we've talked now about Reconstruction, and we've talked a bit, or I hope you've had a chance to watch videos and look at material on American industrialization, the industrialization of the United States in the late 19th century. Most of that, at least it was, in terms of volume, in terms of the focus of that industrialization, a great deal of it is happening in the Midwest and in the northern states. New England, New York City is becoming a major center for commerce. But it always seems to me to be a good idea to consider breaking up the way we look at this era of industrialization regionally. And so we can look at the United States South, which is those states we talked about with Reconstruction in particular that had been party to this business of secession that occurred leading to the American Civil War, the United States Civil War. We can also look at the West and the western portions of the United States, predominantly, of course, west of the Mississippi River. Today, I want to take some time and talk a bit about what's often referred to as the New South. And really, I suppose it just means the South transformed. What were the changes taking place in the southern United States as a result of both the Civil War and the process of industrialization that's going on throughout the country? It's sort of a test case, if you will, to consider a single region and see how this business of industrialization and economic development differed in different areas of the United States. To do that, I want to start out by talking a bit about the antebellum, or that just simply means the pre-war, in this case pre-Civil War structure, social structure of the South. And it's an oversimplification. I suppose most things in a survey are, because you're sort of hitting the high points and you're moving very quickly through time. But the sort of simplified version of Southern society before the Civil War has the group on top that controls land and predominantly is engaged in commercial agriculture and other pursuits related to agriculture. This, of course, would be the so-called planter class in the South. They owned the most slaves, tended to control the most land per person, certainly, or per family. But they were also, because of their wealth, engaged in other investments. For instance, they might be engaged in manufacturing. They might be professionals, lawyers. They might be engaged in commerce of various kinds. So it's really not the best idea to think of this planter class as just slave owners running plantations. Much more varied than that. But the one thing that really does, I think, set them apart in Southern society, and we'll talk more about this in just a bit, but really sets them apart is their control of labor. That is just so central to who these planters were. And central, if we drop back just a moment, central to why things like the Black Codes of Reconstruction were so important, because the Black Codes reinstituted control over labor. In the case of the antebellum planters, that labor was predominantly slave labor. Now we also have, for lack of a better term in the South, a class of independent farmers who don't quite measure up as well to the planter class in terms of wealth, ownership of slaves, ownership of property, or really activity commercially. But they are economically independent. They do own land. They do often own slaves, or some own slaves. We call this class oftentimes the yeoman class. Now, you might have a class that was specifically professional. the lawyers, the doctors of the world, and that was their primary mode. But again, I don't mean to set these various groupings off as completely unrelated to one another. Yeomen could become planters in the South. Given the right circumstances, the right conditions, they could develop over time, whether it be years or by way of marriage perhaps even, they could potentially become planters. And similarly, planters were often involved in the professions and in investment. So if you think about it structurally, you've got planters on top, and then you have this kind of independent farming class, business class, and then at the bottom of white society. And I want to emphasize that. With everything I've mentioned so far, we are talking in racial terms about white society. You have what have been called the mud seals, and that's sort of a reference to the lowest area when you step through a door, right? The seal of the door, as it's called, being not made of wood or stone or anything else, but essentially being just mud, an opening on the ground. The point of that is that it's reflective of the idea of a dirt floor. You're too poor to even afford flooring, whether it be split logs or whatever. You just can't even afford it. Well, there was a whole class in the South of individuals who belonged to this sort of group of mud seals. They often didn't own land, and land was one of the things that really made a difference to your status in the South. But they didn't own land oftentimes. They were the landless population, and they worked for others. They were wage earners. I guess the best way to think about them they were often the people who herded animals, who were hired to look after crops, who found the odd jobs that might be available just to get by. But the interesting thing is, beneath this kind of white society, not alongside it, not in any way considered equal in the Old South, but beneath this white society, you had slaves, and you had free African Americans. For free African Americans, life was an absolute struggle. I mean, there's just no way around that. It was true for slaves as well, so please don't misunderstand. But in some ways, as individuals who were not protected, except by laws that weren't always applied to them, freed slaves in the antebellum South just had a horribly rough existence confronting them. They were treated entirely unequally, though they were considered, or could be considered, landowners, and had to go through the legal system for redress. And it was a system that simply did not account for them oftentimes. Well, the way that the white social structure worked also really diminished the capacity of free African Americans in this sort of lower strata, or a term I might use here is this lower caste, because it's a social level in which one is born, right? A social level based on race. In white society, you had the planters or the wealthy. They were often the leaders of society. At least they wanted to see themselves that way. A term that's often used is that of patron. They were patrons. And the yeomen often had come, for whatever reason, to depend upon the largesse of the planter class. It might be opportunities for land purchase, opportunities for employment. If they needed cash, they might go to the planter. If they needed credit, in other words, they might go to the planter. In politics, oftentimes, depending on where you were in the South, but oftentimes the planter had this position of status that put them in a position of leadership. So that if you owed favors to your particular patron and election day came around, it might not be so uncommon to follow the lead of that patron, who might very well expect your support come election day. The thing about this caste structure that I think really makes it all come clear is the notion that African Americans, slave or even free, are never allowed to go above the sort of surface, the ceiling that caste, which is based on race, something, it's cultural, but in that cultural sense, you're born into this lower caste. It's something you can't escape. So that really, for a freed slave to participate in this social order, in this patron-client relationship of the Old South that was reserved for whites, is virtually impossible. Virtually impossible in any meaningful way. I also want to remind you that this social structure, this caste system with various classes within the castes, planter, yeoman, the sort of mud seal or landless white, and then the lower caste where you have slaves and you also have freed slaves or freed African Americans. This social structure is based on an economy that is tied to commercial crops by and large. We could talk about cotton, of course, but there's also tobacco. Southerners grew hemp. Numerous other crops that were grown, rice, South Carolina particularly comes to mind. But they're all, in one way or another, commercial crops. Even the yeoman and landless whites ultimately depended upon this economy that involved commercial crop growing. And what I mean by that, to try to handle this kind of quickly, I guess, what I mean by that is even if in parts of the South you weren't growing cotton, even if you were growing corn, for instance, you might very well be growing your corn crop so that you could sell your surplus. And that surplus might very well go to feeding hogs or other animals. And along with the surplus, then the meat may be very well sold in areas of the South where commercial crop economy and slavery are predominant. It was often the case that so-called hogs and hominy, or pork and corn, would be sold to markets in the South and become the basis of the slave diet in the deep South states. So even if you weren't directly involved in this sort of commercial slave-based agriculture in the South, nonetheless, you might very well be tied in. So there's been a lot of argument as to how sort of capitalistic the Southern economy was, whether the planter mentality was that of a sort of aristocrat, a medieval baron or lord of the manor, sort of feudal in structure, or whether in fact these Southern planters were basically capitalists engaged in a capitalist system. And again, I don't seek to answer that exactly. I do have my opinion. And I think very much this was a capitalist system in the South operating within markets. And I think planters and yeomen were often very much aware of markets as they sought to build wealth and opportunity for themselves and their families.